Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on the role of regional transmission organizations in the development of renewables. My name is Megha Hamal. I am the Communications Manager for the IPA, and I will be responsible for hosting this presentation today. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, we have muted participants upon entry. We've also enabled the live transcript button for the meeting today. If you wish to hide the live transcript, you may click on the live transcript button, then hide subtitle. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to answer your questions. As you can tell, today's session is being recorded, and a recorded version of this webinar will be available on the IPA website under About IPA Events. Couple of points I would like to emphasize. This webinar is for general education purpose only. The views and content expressed in the presentation do not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or IPA staff. After the webinar is completed, we will be sending a quick survey to gauge your feedback on the session. Now, without a further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our speakers for this session are Anthony Starr, Director, Illinois Power Agency; Rob Gramlich, Founder and President, Grid Strategies, a power sector consulting firm based in DC. Grid Strategies works for consumer advocates, states, clean energy companies and associations, and environmental NGOs on grid reforms for low-cost decarbonization. Prior to this, Rob oversaw transmission and power market policy for the American Wind Energy Association from 2005 through 2016. He has also served as economic advisor to FERC chairman from 2001 to 2005, senior economist at PJM Interconnection in 1999 and 2000. Welcome, Rob. Our last presenter for the session is Catherine McCormick. Catherine is the Assistant Director of Policy Division at the Illinois Commerce Commission, tracking and advising on federal energy issues, primarily related to MISO and PJM. Prior to joining the commission, Kate worked on energy policy with the Natural Resources Defense Council, followed by work on civic engagement and consulting on sustainable food ventures with City Colleges of Chicago and New Venture Advisors. Welcome, Kate. Again, here's a quick agenda. So we're doing the housekeeping and introductions right now, but we will be talking about regional transmission organizations' role and clean energy issues, regional transmission organizations and the Illinois RPS, and then taking a deep dive on the ICC's role in grid planning for the renewables, and we will allocate some time for the Q&A towards the end of the session. For those that are new to our Power Hour, here's a quick introduction of our Power Hour webinars. It's a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. As I mentioned, today the speakers will be providing an overview and background on the role of RTOs in the development of renewables, look at current challenges facing the RTOs and conversations around potential policy fixes, discuss how RECs are tracked and generated to meet the Illinois RPS, and then finally looking at the role of Illinois Commerce Commissions in grid planning for the development of renewables. Future Power Hour webinars will cover topics related to the clean energy economy in Illinois. And then here's a quick snapshot of the Power Hour that are taking place in September and October. So if you have not registered for these webinars, please go ahead and register by simply clicking the links. A quick introduction of the IPA. The Illinois Power Agency, we are an independent state agency created by law in 2007. Our duties include developing and implementing procurement plans for electricity supply for utility customers. We're also responsible for developing and implementing renewable energy programs, and also responsible for implementing the renewable portfolio standard. With that, I would like to pass the presentation over to Rob.
Thank you, Megha. Great to be with everybody. Here, I'll give a little bit of kind of regional transmission organization origin story, and then get to current issues here. And we'll go ahead and dive in on the next slide. As Megha said, we at Grid Strategies, well, this is just the disclaimer. These are our views, not IPAs or anybody else's. But we at Grid Strategies have been focused on wholesale power markets and transmission for many years, 30 years in my case, and my colleagues a pretty long time as well. And part of the reason for that is really for clean energy. We'll talk about the interaction of these large regional power markets and transmission for clean energy development here. But let me start chronologically to kind of fill folks in on what these RTOs are, where they came from. First of all, the industry in its development over the last 100 years largely grew up out of vertically integrated utilities. Each one you could consider sort of a little silo serving its city or part of a state, hundreds of them around the country. And then it was in the in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of the connections were built up for reliability purposes to share power between areas as sort of a backup. Each utility was a backup to its neighbor. But then in the mid 90s, there was a wave for competition and restructuring. Illinois was certainly deep in that in terms of setting up wholesale markets, and in many states, about 20 states, retail markets, including Illinois. And as part of that, there was an effort to regionalize for wholesale competition purposes, to have generators competing across a many-state area, which created a lot more competition in the generation space. Instead of just choosing whatever generator might be next door, you had all these options, and the customers had much greater competitive options. So that was really the purpose in the late 90s and early 2000s. The map here is the I'm not sure, there's always changes. Every time I put up a map, I feel like there's changes, but it looks like this one was grabbed from 2015. But this is roughly what the RTOs are in North America. There's a couple in Canada. Texas is not FERC jurisdictional. The rest are jurisdictional to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, and FERC for, from the mid 90s through 2005, or really to the present, has been trying to encourage these. A couple of times it tried to require them without success. But it still strongly supports RTOs for their just and reasonable rate authorities and reliability authorities. RTOs help them with that, as well as promote competition, which has been the tool, the means FERC has used towards the end of just and reasonable wholesale power rates. So, and in your state, in Illinois, you can see you're right on the border of MISO and PJM. Long story there, but it's largely been up to the utilities to choose which RTOs they participate in. So next slide describes the characteristics and functions by the kind of the governing FERC rule, which is Order 2000, issued in 1999. I think the chairman Hecker, who oversaw the commission at that time, would say he would have loved to have made it mandatory, didn't quite have the votes to do that at that time, but they did sort of put together the construct with the characteristics. You can see independence as large as possible, and having actual operational authority over the short-term market and responsibility for short-term reliability. And to do that is the following set of 8 functions. They're basically running the short-term transmission service and energy spot market. And then number 7, we'll talk more about the planning of the transmission system is a really important function for them. So it's, so there's not only operational functions. You can sort of think of them as not only the air traffic controller, but also sort of the infrastructure planner for the regions. So next slide. So that's what RTOs do, and you saw the map of what they are. By the way, the terms are functionally interchangeable: independent system operator or regional transmission organization. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. FERC was trying to get all of the ISOs to be broader regional entities, not single state entities, but that didn't really happen, and some still have ISO in their name, but it's functionally the same thing. Now, why are they important? I think they're really important for states like Illinois to achieve their goals under CEJA and other state actions, because they provide these important functions that really are important for low-cost clean energy. I would say not just, whether you think most of the clean energy will be on a distributed kind of behind the meter basis, and connecting at the distribution level, or the large scale, wind and solar farms at the transmission level. I think in either case, the same physical factors apply, where you need a robust grid. So you need a transmission planning function. You need non-discriminatory and efficient interconnection. Of course, we'll talk about that, how efficient they are with kind of the recent interconnection queue delays, but at least they have the potential to make it more efficient. Flow-based large regional operations for efficient delivery and scheduling. There's all kinds of sand in the gears if you look out on the West, which I do some work in the West, and boy, it's just so much more efficient for the day-to-day delivery back and forth inside the RTOs than what the other Southeast and Interior West are dealing with. Regional resource adequacy is really efficient or really important. We're going to talk a little about what's going on in capacity markets today. And then barrier-free entry for new technologies is important. They're sort of more open access than the standard open access transmission systems, because of the independent operation largely and the technology neutrality that is kind of core to how the tariffs are set up. So for these reasons, most clean energy and environmental interests for the last over 20 years have advocated to try to get RTOs in place across the country. That work is still being done in the Southeast and Interior West, hopefully for not too much longer, but at this point, only 2/3 of the country are under RTOs, not the whole country. And then so we'll talk in a few minutes about are they accomplishing all these things and providing the promises that we hope for out of RTOs. Next slide. So just quickly, the next few slides are intended to emphasize that you need to move a lot of power across a lot of distance to have clean energy. If you really model the power systems, the models are screaming out for more transmission delivery capacity and for seamless exchange of power, not just to get remote resources. Like, people kind of know intuitively, okay, there's really cheap, land and high productive wind resources in Iowa and the Dakotas that could deliver to Chicago and points east. But what you find is the power goes back and forth. When you have renewable resources operating in different time zones and wind regimes, you send power back and forth. So the plot on the right is from an NREL study that shows up to 40 gigawatts moving back and forth on a daily basis, diurnal cycle. To move power back and forth when you have a high renewable grid, and there's only just over 1 gigawatt. So you need almost a 40x increase in the capacity of the east to western interconnection. And next slide. It's also important to keep in mind that to move large amounts of power for a consumer standpoint, we want to do this on the most efficient basis as possible. So and the high voltage, high capacity lines are a lot more efficient per megawatt hour delivered than lower voltage approaches. You can see if you went all the way to 765, it's a quarter the cost, and you can see the land use consumption in the map is a lot less. If to the extent we need new rights of way, we'll probably need some. There's a lot we can do over existing corridors, but we'll probably need some rights of way. So we want to minimize land impact. So that kind of forces the question of, well, let's plan for the long term now to minimize land use and minimize cost over the long term. Next slide. Now that whole agenda scares people because it seems like it's impossible to site new transmission. Well, the reality is we have done it, therefore we can do it. The winning formula that's been put in place in 4 different regions about a decade ago is this proactive multi-benefit planning with relatively broad beneficiary pays cost allocation. So all beneficiaries pay a share. No individual entity has to pay an undue burden. And it's not purely socialized across everybody in the same way. It can be more beneficiary pay. So certain load zones can pay more than others, for example. But that basic formula has been used and it works. And that basic formula is what you find as I would say the heart of the FERC proposed rule. So it's kind of catching on. Okay, so let's go to the next slide on. So what are some of the current RTO issues? And I'll try to wrap up soon. The interconnection queue reform is a big one. My quick comment on that is the reforms proposed by FERC can help, and very similar reforms are being pursued independently at MISO and PJM. But in a way, those are just kind of thinning out the queue. The real constraint is the physical infrastructure. So that gets to the next bullet is transmission planning. MISO's long-range transmission planning is helpful. PJM needs to, I think, do some more. Another current issue, resource adequacy, capacity market design, capacity accreditation. In other words, what's the capacity credit that wind or solar or storage get, and do fossil fuels, get their sort of full capacity credit given their is sometimes common outage sources. That's another area. Grid enhancing technology deployment is another area RTOs are working in. Clean energy procurement options. There's consideration at PJM about this, whether the states get together or PJM has a role in procurement. The minimum offer price rule was, I think, a very damaging rule in PJM. MISO, I thought, was smart to not go down that road. And for now, it's sort of dormant, but you never know. It could come back, and it's something to keep an eye on. I testified in the Illinois legislature about that a couple of years ago. But that's definitely an issue to the extent it rears its ugly head, as I would look at it. So those are some of the current issues. And then next slide, just to note that we're not on that transmission planning bullet. This is, I think, why FERC is acting, is if you look around the RTOs, it's been sort of episodic. Sometimes MISO will put together plans, but not always. And then most regions are not really doing any of this. So it's good that the RTOs, sometimes at state's encouragement, are doing more proactive planning. And it's good, I think, that FERC is acting. On the next slide, you can see the effect that this episodic and inconsistent planning has had, which is that the line miles, if you can pull the next slide up, the line miles has been falling since, again, we did a lot around 10 years ago, and then it's been falling. These are miles of 345 kV and above based on our grid strategies analysis. That's been falling because planning hasn't been done routinely. And the way to do this on the next slide, I think the MISO concept is right. They used to call this the smile curve, now maybe the bathtub curve, but it's essentially there is a kind of a sweet spot between the right amount of transmission connecting remote cheap generation. You don't want to do everything locally and underspend on transmission. You don't want to do everything remotely and overspend on transmission. There is a sweet spot, and that's what a good planning process will identify and focus on. And that's what MISO is trying to do. So on the next slide, and this is my last, this is the a picture of what MISO put together, the MISO Long Range Transmission Plan. It's part of their Future One, so-called Future One. They're looking at different scenarios. Future 3 gets all the way to much more significant decarbonization with a lot of electrification, and Futures 1 and 2 are sort of steps towards that. And so they're going one step at a time. This step that they recently approved in July has, by their calculation, $37 billion of benefit, $10 billion of cost. And I think that reflects the kind of the proactive multi-benefit planning that I was talking about. If you look at the reliability and resilience benefits and how much everybody across the footprint shares, turns out every load zone gets some benefit out of these lines. In fact, each load zone gets over twofold benefit over cost from these lines, given all the variety of uses of transmission. So hopefully we'll see more of this, both from MISO and then PJM, to look, for example, more at offshore wind and a meshed grid there. And then I guess I'll wrap up there. Look forward to the discussion on the last slide here. If you want some of these papers, we post here at the link there if you want to look them up, and you can contact any of us here at Grid Strategies through that website as well. So I'll turn it back to you, Megha.
Thanks, Rob. I think it's Anthony next. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Megha and Rob. That was a really good overview of this big picture of what regional transmission organizations do and what their implications are for as we think about the future clean energy economy. I think we're going to go from that higher level now. I'm going to talk a bit about specifically how this intersects with the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, and then Kate will be talking about the grid planning work that the Commission will be doing. So again, this will be bringing it down to a more Illinois-focused level. So next slide, please. So this is sort of a zooming in on a similar map to the one Rob showed of the different RTOs. And I think the key issue for Illinois to think about and to be aware of is the fact that we are one of the states that has part of our state in one RTO and part of our state in another RTO. We're split between PJM and MISO. A notable thing is of the states that have that split, we're the only state with full retail competition. There is some competition in Michigan, but not to the extent that they have a restructured market like we have in Illinois. So the intersection of what happened at the RTO level versus what is at the state policy level is unique for Illinois compared to the states around us and the other states in these two RTOs. We also have an interesting dynamic that the PJM portion of Illinois, which covers Chicago and much of northern Illinois, is about 70% of the load of the state. So the majority of the electricity consumed in Illinois is consumed in PJM. On the other hand, and this becomes, I think, relevant as we think about future renewable energy options, particularly with something like wind farms, which take up large geographic areas, the majority of land area of Illinois is in MISO, in areas served either by Ameren or by rural electric cooperatives. And we've seen to date that most of the wind development in Illinois has been in the MISO part of the state. There is some west of Chicago, the DeKalb area, there's some areas that have good wind resources. So I think we have an interesting geography for thinking about renewables, given the split and between the two RTOs, and given the differences in the dynamics between where consumption takes place and where there is space available for new projects. And as I go forward talking about how the Illinois RPS works, there are, I think, aspects of that have already accounted for that are helpful. So next slide, please. So quick overview of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard. It was first enacted in 2007 and then significantly revised in 2016 with the Future Energy Jobs Act, and then last fall with the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. At a high level, we have a goal of getting to 40% renewables by 2030 and 50% by 2040, and additional decarbonization goals above and beyond that. And we do this through a centralized process of programs and procurements administered by the Illinois Power Agency. So we have the Adjustable Block Program and the Illinois Solar for All program, which are both designed to support distributed generation and community solar. We also have what's known as coal to solar procurements, which are provisions coming out of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act to create an opportunity for solar projects at certain former coal plant sites. But in terms of where RTOs fit into this is really on the large scale project, large scale wind farms, large scale solar projects. So we have administered by the Illinois Power Agency competitive procurements for those types of projects, as well as a new large customer self-direct program, which is a new way in which entities in Illinois that are very large customers can support the development of renewables. A key thing from the point of view of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard is that our compliance paths are through the purchase of renewable energy credits. I sometimes like to think of this, that we see the world through renewable energy credits, or RECs. So while there's a lot, obviously, in terms of how energy projects get developed, in terms of the technical engineering aspects, energy capacity, when it comes down to the RPS, we're looking at RECs as the way we're measuring what we're doing in Illinois in terms of meeting our goals. The specific thing I want to highlight is that the RPS does not have any requirements that RECs have to come from any specific RTO. So we're agnostic as to whether the RECs that support the Illinois RPS come from projects that are located in PJM or located in MISO. If you want more information to a deeper dive on the specifics of our programs and procurements, we've been having these power hours since last fall. I have a link available there that would bring you to those previous events, and a great way to learn more about the specific programs. Next slide, please. So a little bit quick about renewable energy credits. So there's two different tracking systems that track renewable energy credits. There's the PJM gas system, which is run by PJM. It includes projects located in PJM, but can also register projects in other states. And there's also the MRED system, which is for projects located in MISO. It is not run by MISO, it's run by an independent nonprofit, but they have a service agreement with MISO to get data from MISO to support the information about the generation of renewable energy credits. Both systems have a variety of public reports that allow you to see what projects are registered in them, their size, and some other information about them. The key concept to connect the dots between all of this is that in both systems, each renewable energy credit is associated with 1 megawatt hour of production. And each renewable energy credit has a unique certificate number with it and can be tied to the month of generation. Emirates has been doing some pilots about actually having renewable energy credits that are tied to more granular energy use than at the monthly level. But right now, the basic paradigm for renewable energy credits is really thinking about the production of energy at a monthly level. A key thing to note is that both systems list projects that might participate in the Illinois RPS as well as projects that do not. For example, you could have a project located in Illinois that is selling renewable energy credits for compliance with a portfolio standard in other states, or someone may be selling the renewable energy credits to private customers for their environmental sustainability goals. Next slide, please. A few other things in terms of thinking about the Illinois RPS, and again, this connects back to why regional transmission organizations are important here, is that our eligibility is that renewable energy credits have to come from either projects located in Illinois. They can be in an adjacent state if that project meets a public interest criteria. And in our what we call our long-term renewable resources procurement plan, we lay out a methodology, a point scoring system for projects in adjacent states in terms of how they benefit the public of Illinois. So we have a process for that. It's roughly speaking a sort of a geographic process by which projects that are located closer to Illinois in the adjacent states score higher points. Each state's a little different because we factor in a number of factors such as wind direction, generation mix, et cetera, into how we consider the public interest criteria for projects in other states. We also have new from the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, a provision related to high voltage direct current transmission lines, and that renewable energy credits associated with energy delivered over such a line to what's called a converter station in the PJM area of Illinois are also now eligible for the Illinois RPS. So that actually somewhat expands the geographic footprint of eligible RECs for the Illinois RPS if they meet that specific provision. We also have a provision that renewable energy credits can't come from projects that have their costs recovered through regulated rates. In other words, projects have to be merchant projects rather than the rate base of a utility in another state. Next slide, please. So I also want to touch on, so what does this mean? So we have a renewable portfolio standard in Illinois where we're procuring renewable energy credits. At the same time, most people, when they think about electricity or energy markets, are thinking about energy or capacity. So we have two different processes in place. So for renewable energy credits, we're procuring them through the various programs and procurements run by the IPA for Ameren, ComEd, and Mid-American. And we're basing all of that on goals for across all of their retail customers. On the energy and capacity side, since Illinois is a restructured state, customers can choose who their supplier is. The Illinois Power Agency, we procure for what is known as the eligible retail customers. Those are the residential and small commercial customers who haven't chosen another supply option. That ends up being about 20 to 25% of the total load in the state. Other customers either are taking the power from an alternative retail electric supplier or they're on real-time pricing. So we have a disconnect in that we're procuring renewable energy credits through one set of processes for a larger universe of customers. Energy and capacity, which is also key for the obviously the economics of any project, are going to be procured through other means. One change that came from CEJA was the new index rec procurement model for utility scale projects. This is designed to reduce the need for those projects to find off-takers for just the energy component. So if they're selling the renewable energy credits to the utilities as part of the Illinois RPS, by having that price be indexed, it's designed to reduce market risk for the developers of those projects. We also have the large customer self-direct program, which allows large customers to go out and procure renewable energy credits from large scale wind or solar projects. And those will also be an opportunity for developers of projects to bundle RECs and energy together. Another way in which the Illinois RPS is creating some flexibility for project development point of view to create different options and avenues for the economics of the project development. Next slide, please. So something that Rob hinted at a bit, and Kate will be getting to as well, is so what are the implications of what's going on at the RTO level for the Illinois RPS? So obviously RTOs and the role that they play in energy markets is essential for facilitating the development of new renewable energy projects. And we're going to need that to be able to meet our RPS goals. We're going to need thousands and thousands of megawatts of new development to be able to do that. There are obviously concerns about things like interconnection delays and things like that that are slowing down the development of renewable energy projects. So one of the things that the IPA we have been doing is really to be monitoring those and thinking about how we factor into our competitive procurements things like development timelines and project maturity requirements as the interconnection issues at the RTO level get worked through. So we're definitely monitoring these things, thinking about what we can do to facilitate them. But again, these are lots of different processes that all have to come together to ultimately build what's coming next for renewables. And so with that, I will pause and I will turn it over to Kate.
Great, thank you. So again, my name is Kate. I'm an assistant director with the ICC. I'm in our policy division and I head up our federal policy team. Next slide. I don't know if I have control. Okay. So the normal disclaimer slide is the one we just ran through. I'm not representing the views of our commissioners or other staff. So I just wanted to go through the ICC and how we interact with those RTOs that we've been talking about. And we do this through a few different ways. One of them are through these intergovernmental organizations called OPSI and OMS. OPSI is the organization of PJM states incorporated, and OMS is the organization of MISO states. And we have a series of meetings, and we talk deeply about all of the topics going on and facing PJM and MISO and areas of interest to the states, including the achievement of state priorities. State priorities differ from state to state, and we're an outlier in a lot of ways in each of those regions. And so we are somewhat limited in what we can achieve through OPSI and OMS, but overall, it's still a very powerful forum to really dig into some of these issues and get questions answered from PJM and MISO, and then and other stakeholders, and then provide the state feedback on things like cost effectiveness and the importance of state priorities, even if we don't agree on what those are. The other way in which we engage is as the Illinois Commerce Commission, and this is both MISO and PJM have a lot of stakeholder forums in which we can participate and do in both transmission planning in the interconnection space and reforms to that, in market design and any changes that might be coming. And then I included a couple of other things that happen at the ICC level, which right now are integrated distribution planning, which I'll get into, and then the CPCN process and interconnection at the distribution level, neither of which are part of my team's work, but do happen at the Illinois Commerce Commission as well. So the next slide. So I know people on this call are probably pretty familiar with CEJA, but the link to it is here. And then it has created a lot more work for the Illinois Commerce Commission. And all of the implementation activities related to CEJA can be found at the link at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. So one of the things that I quickly mentioned was this integrated distribution planning. CEJA did create basically a whole new division at the ICC. It also required that the larger electric utilities in the state engage in a multi-year integrated distribution planning process. So the new division, which we call IDP, reviews and evaluates the plans that these utilities are putting together. And in order to put together those plans, one component of it was a series of workshops would be held. The goals were to really increase transparency and make sure that the outcome of it is also equitable. So both in the process and in the outcome. The next slide. So under that, the commission conducted workshops that were organized and facilitated in a manner that encourages representation from diverse stakeholders. And so this did not require formal intervention or representation by an attorney. The workshops were held, I think, beginning in late spring. Those are done. There's a facilitator's report as well as all of the presentation materials available at the link on the slide. And then the commission after that initiated proceedings in which ComEd and Ameren will file multi-year integrated distribution plan by January. Next slide. One of the other things that came out of CEJA was that the ICC has to open an investigation to develop and adopt a renewable energy access plan by the end of this year. So this process began earlier in this year. We partnered with the Brattle Group and Great Lakes Engineering to develop a first draft REAP, which was published at the beginning of July, and which triggered a 120-day comment period. So that's open right now. I wanted to, so the REAP is really meant to essentially identify renewable energy zones in the state through a combination of both where the renewable energy resources are and where land seems suitable for developing that generating capacity. And that is not, it's not a direction from the state that that land should be developed in that way, but it's just where do we think it's most likely? And that's based on a range of factors. And even what those factors are is part of the feedback that we're soliciting. So that could be, it's basically like layering on, okay, here's where there's technical potential in the state, but let's also consider where there's valuable land that we might not want to disrupt or that might be used for other purposes, where there might be environmental justice considerations, where some fossil plants might be closing, and we might have additional incentive to want to see some specific zones developed. It might include Other environmental considerations like endangered species. So we're working with the Illinois DNR on identifying areas like that. So the idea is to develop these zones or to develop the identification of these zones that might eventually be developed by private developers, not by the state, and and to identify what infrastructure might be needed to really unlock that potential. So, and that's primarily transmission infrastructure, but it also means that we're going to the RTOs and advocating for market changes that that might reduce some of the barriers as well. So we're in the middle of that. The first draft REAP was published on July 12th, like I mentioned. We are having 3 workshops. The first one already occurred on August 16th, but we're having 2 more on September 12th and October 6th. The comment period ends on November 9th, and then we'll be presenting the second draft REAP to our commission in December, when they will initiate the investigation. There will be a more formal comment period, and then we'll finalize the REAP in early 2023. Next slide. So the first draft REAP came out with a few strategic elements. Again, this is meant to provide a comprehensive plan to meet our climate and clean energy goals in an equitable, reliable, and cost-effective manner. The strategic elements that were identified in the report include some really high renewable energy supply needs that are also really uncertain, because a lot of that depends on what happens with the assumptions around what happens with nuclear and the phase out of the fossil fuels. Needing to clarify certain policy instruments and enforcement authorities will let us figure out what reforms might be needed. So we need to clarify some of those authorities and possibilities in RTO reforms. Identifying renewable energy access zones should enable a repeatable process. So I didn't mention this, but starting in 2025, we'll be updating this report every other year. So the information will remain current, and we can continue to provide it into any RTO transmission planning processes. Next slide. The existing transmission infrastructure should be optimized to support renewable resource deployment. Strategic element number 5 was that, and this echoes some of what Rob already talked about, but proactive planning of new transmission with the consideration of public policy needs is superior to relying on interconnection processes to reach CEJA's goals. And then the 6th is that the RTO markets will require enhancements to support effective, reliable, and affordable implementation. Next slide. And again, this is the role of the RTO markets in supporting this. So currently we're talking with them a lot, and the second workshop, as noted on the earlier slide, will actually include some presentations from the RTOs. And the goal of that is to have the RTOs provide information and data support to the ICC and other agencies throughout this transition. We want to ensure reliability on all timeframes without relying on fossil resource extensions or dispatch above the greenhouse gas allowance limits. We need their support to identify, analyze, and implement market design enhancements. And then we want to maximize opportunities to really use markets to most cost effectively coordinate this transition. So next slide. And I have a few issue areas that I wanted to kind of dig into as an example of the kinds of work that we're engaged in and how we approach some of this. So resource adequacy in MISO Zone 4 is kind of a hot topic. Back in April, there was a planning resource auction that resulted in higher than normal prices. Normal prices are close to zero. These prices were over $200. And we're trying to figure out, okay, there's this gap. And then there was a OMS MISO survey that identified a gap in Zone 4, which is the Ameren region, that extends into the next few years, probably. And so that's what this image is on the slide. And I want to just note that there's a gap definitely between the bar and that black line, which is where we really need to be to ensure resource adequacy. But we also have the biggest blue bar of all of those, which means that's potential new capacity that could come online. And we should see that continue to grow over the years as well, especially under CEJA. Next slide. So we're doing a lot of things in response to the PRA. One of those is the Renewable Energy Access Plan and using it to identify opportunities to close that gap, essentially. We're also paying attention to interconnection reform to the extent that the interconnection queue delays are causing any of the any of the gap between retiring fossil resources and new clean resources. We're paying attention to that and supporting reform efforts. Market reforms are under discussion in the MISO forums, including the shape of the demand curve in those planning resource auctions. There's a seasonal construct that would carve that year up into 4 separate seasons instead of using one annual peak and kind of in running that auction, and then the accreditation of resources, and we're paying attention to that. There's a conversation underway right now about how we accredit non-thermal resources, and we want to make sure that that is done fairly. PJM and MISO transfers. PJM currently over procures, so we're just making sure that the path is clear for PJM to continue to push energy into the MISO region, as well as there are some generators that are actively moving from PJM into MISO, responding to that higher capacity price. And then I can't talk about this in detail, but the commission did initiate did order Ameren to conduct a cost benefit analysis of remaining in MISO versus joining one of the other RTOs. And then we continue to focus on energy efficiency and demand response. And that is both the utility programs, but aside from that, other non-utility energy efficiency opportunities under the IIJA and now the Inflation Reduction Act, through things like an expanded energy efficiency block grant program. Are there ways in which we could continue to affect the demand side of the equation as well? Next slide. Transmission planning in PJM is another major focus of ours right now. PJM's planning processes do not proactively consider public policy as a driver unless the state invokes the state agreement approach, in which the state agrees to take on all of the costs for the projects that come out of that. This leads to an excess reliance on individual resource interconnection requests to drive planning results, to drive the planning, which results in higher costs and delays associated with the queue process. They do not have a planning process such as that used in MISO, and we're continuing to work with them on expanding what Illinois might need in light of CEJA and the fossil phase out and the projections of renewable headroom. And one of those things that in the picture is the offshore wind transmission study, which is completely misnamed. And so if you haven't looked at it, it might be good to take a look at. They're going to come out with an updated version, which fully incorporates the new state goals under CEJA. And that'll be, I think, towards the end of the year. Next slide. And this was also touched on earlier, but interconnection reform, the processes that exist are too slow for policy requirements. This is not a uniquely Illinois problem. This is affecting any state with goals. The images here just show that like a lot of what's caught up in the queue are these renewable resources that are needed to meet the state goals, primarily solar. If you move forward one slide, there's also there's the MISO image, also primarily solar and wind in the early years. And if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly touch on basically next steps. At FERC, they have sent out transmission planning NOPRs and a generator interconnection NOPR. The ICC responded to the transmission planning NOPR and signed on to the OMS comments in that space, and will likely do the same for the generator interconnection NOPR, so filing our own comments and then working with OMS and OPSI on potential comments on that as well. In MISO, we're following a lot of the different areas. I mentioned accreditation. The seasonal construct is in front of FERC right now. My understanding is that if it doesn't get denied before September 1st, then it kind of just goes into effect. So MISO is actively planning as if the next PRA will incorporate the seasonal construct. PJM, there's an interconnection queue reform process that's underway right now that may not go far enough, but should at least move the needle. And then the capacity market is up here because they are undergoing not only a quadrennial review process in which they're going to determine the shape of their demand curve, but they're also engaged in something called the Clean Attribute Procurement Senior Task Force, or CAPSTIF, that we are a member of. And along with all of OPSI, this is really OPSI driven, but the CAPSTIF is looking at ways to create a mechanism in the capacity market for states and other purchasers of capacity to identify what capacity they want to be purchasing. So they're not both supporting clean resources through state policy, but also accidentally subsidizing through the capacity market some of the fossil resources within the region. So that's some exciting conversation. And then at the Illinois Commerce Commission, we have work ongoing at the state level. I already talked a lot about the REAP, but there were also beneficial electrification and storage workshops, which resulted in reports that we sent to the legislature. So there might be more work in that space. And then Order 2222, I just wanted to throw in there. This is access for aggregations of distributed resources to participate in the wholesale markets. Both MISO and PJM filed for implementation deadlines of, in PJM is 2026 and MISO would effectively be 2030, which is a very long timeline. And we oppose that length of the timeline, but we do have a little bit of time for states to be proactively thinking about how we're gonna do this. My colleague, Zach Callan, is the chair at MISO of the DERFT, the Distributed Energy Resources Task Force that is specifically looking at how to implement Order 2222, even if it doesn't become formal until 2030. So I will leave it there. I know we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Kate. So there is a question that came in the chat window. Has there been any conversations about flexible interconnection to assist with getting more distributed energy resources interconnected to the grid?
I don't have much to comment on that since that's distribution level. I don't follow that much. I don't know if Kate does or Anthony.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment sort of along those lines that for distributed energy resources, yeah, they're connected to the distribution system of the local utilities. So the issues affecting them are going to be different from issues affecting interconnection issues at the transmission level. Where there's also some maybe interesting intersections of this is how do we view renewable resources at the distribution level as potential capacity resources, and I know that's sort of an ongoing topic of discussion.
Great, thank you. We don't have another question, but actually I do want to ask Rob this question. I know you touched upon infrastructure being key to modernizing transmission planning. What kind of infrastructure are we talking about, like technology or storage, smart grid? Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? I'm just curious.
Sure. Well, mainly I think bulk power transmission infrastructure to move lots of power around across regions. I mean, Illinois could take advantage of offshore wind, and New Jersey can take advantage of Illinois wind, and both can take advantage of solar that's producing at different times, or it might be cloudy in one place and not the other, and vice versa. So that's the type of power movement and infrastructure. And the challenge with that, harkening back to the first statement about utilities kind of growing up out of these vertical small islands or silos, is that we never had a great way to recover the cost of that large regional infrastructure. So RTOs have helped over the years, but we don't really have anything that's very workable across the RTOs between them. So work needs to be done on that, as well as just the seams for day-to-day operations, and certainly states like Illinois that experience the seams all every day could benefit from more seamless operation between the RTOs. So you could, in a way, consider the kind of the RTO operations as infrastructure that's also important.
Got it. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat window again. Oh, there is one question. Olivia, program associate at the IPA. Her question is, what was the reasoning behind previously not allowing RECs associated with electricity delivered over high voltage direct current transmission lines to converter stations in PJM?
I don't think there was a reason why it was not allowed previously. I think it's more a case that there is at least one proposed line that would meet that definition that that a developer is attempting to have developed. And so during the negotiations that led to CEJA, they were able to advocate for the idea that this should be considered as part of the vast number of changes and reforms in Illinois energy policy. So I think it was more a recognition of a emerging technology that is something that has potential benefits to Illinois that just wasn't really on people's radar prior to this.
Thank you, Anthony. We do have a little bit of time. Maybe we can give it a minute to see if we get another question, if that's okay with the speakers. We do have a comment thanking the IPA for putting on these webinars. So thank you, Nathan. Okay, looks like we don't have any question coming in. Well, I just want to thank our speakers today for giving such a wonderful presentation. If you have any additional questions, we've included our presenters and speakers' contact information on the PowerPoint, so please feel free to reach out to them. Again, thank you again for participating. And our next webinar, Power Hour webinar, will be taking place on September 30th on CEJA recap. So CEJA turns 1 in September. So IPA will be giving a in-depth presentation of things that have occurred since the enactment of CEJA and the activities that we've implemented and challenges and successes. So we hope to see you there. So thank you so much for attending. Have a lovely weekend.